The gas station on the corner of Elm and 5th has been there since 1971. Same sign. Different prices on the board, obviously. But the same faded red trim around the canopy. Same bell that rings when a car pulls over the sensor strip. The same smell of motor oil and cold concrete that hits you when you get out to pump. He's been stopping here since he was 17 years old, borrowing his father's Buick on Friday nights. He's 53 now. He pulls in on a Tuesday morning, same as always. Pays with cash, same as always. Nods at the guy behind the counter. Not his friend exactly. Someone he's known by sight for 30 years, which is its own kind of relationship. Back in the car. Coffee in the cup holder. Town stretching out around him in every direction. The hardware store his grandfather used to take him to. The church where he sat through every Christmas Eve of his entire life. The street where he learned to ride a bike. And the street where his kids learned to ride theirs. His phone buzzes. A college friend texting from Phoenix. Just checked flights to San Diego. You should come out sometime. Seriously. He reads it. Sets the phone face down on the seat. Not because he's angry. Not because he doesn't want to see his friend. Because there's something in that message. That cheerful, well-meaning invitation to somewhere else that has followed him his entire adult life. And he's never quite known how to explain his answer to it. The answer is, I'm already somewhere, but no one ever seems to understand what that means. This is a story about the people who stayed, not because they had to, not because they ran out of options, but because something in them, something real, something worth understanding, chose the place they already knew over every place they'd never been. Psychology has a great deal to say about what that something actually is. Start with the most common assumption, the one that follows people like him around like weather. The assumption is that staying means settling, that the person who never left their hometown is someone who played it safe, who lacked ambition, who was afraid of the unknown or comfortable with the small, or simply never got around to leaving. That assumption is not just wrong. It's almost exactly backwards. Research from the Pew Research Center consistently shows that geographic mobility in America correlates strongly with economic necessity and disruption, not with psychological health or personal ambition. The people most likely to move are often the people who had no other option. And the people who stayed were, in many cases, making a genuine choice. A deliberate one. Choice that reflects a specific and sophisticated understanding of what actually makes a life worth living. But we're getting ahead of the story. Let's go back further. Back to what it was like to grow up in a place and actually know it. There's a particular quality to knowledge that comes from staying somewhere long enough to understand it at every layer. Not just the streets and the landmarks. Those any tourist can learn. The deeper knowledge. The knowledge of which families have been feuding for 40 years and why. Knowledge of which stretch of road floods every spring. The knowledge of which diner is worth the wait, and which one looks good from the outside and disappoints every time. That knowledge accumulates slowly. It can't be downloaded. It can't be acquired on a visit. It comes from years of paying attention to a specific place, and it builds into something that feels, eventually, it's less like information and more like belonging. Think about the last time you walked somewhere you'd walked 1,000 times before. Not paying attention to the route because you don't need to. Body knows the turns. Mind is free to be somewhere else entirely, or nowhere at all. Just moving through a world that has become so familiar, it doesn't demand anything from you. The kind of ease is rarer than people realize, and it matters more than most people acknowledge. There's a woman named Diane. She's 61, has lived her entire life in the same mid-sized Ohio town where her parents grew up, where her grandparents are buried, where her kids went to the same elementary school she attended. She described something she can only call rootedness. A word she admits sounds old-fashioned, but she means something specific by it. She means that she knows where she came from in a way that doesn't require effort. That when she has a hard week, or a good week, or a week where nothing particularly happens, the place around her holds the context of her life in a way that steadies her. The town is, in some sense, her external memory. Her history is written into its streets. When her mother died 4 years ago, Diane didn't have to explain to anyone what that loss meant. The people around her, the ones who had known her mother at church, at the grocery store, at the school board meetings, already understood. They showed up. Not because they had to, because they were there in the way that people who have shared a place for decades are simply there for each other. That's not a small thing. The Harvard study of adult development, one of the longest-running studies on human well-being ever conducted, has followed participants for over 80 years. Its central finding, replicated again and again across decades of data, is not complicated. The quality of a person's close relationships is the single strongest predictor of happiness and health in later life. Not career success, financial security, not geography, relationships. And relationships of the deepest kind, the ones built on years of shared experience, on history, the accumulated trust of showing up for each other through ordinary time, require proximity. Not always physical proximity in the modern age. The kind of relationships that tend to reach that depth are the ones built in places where people's lives overlap regularly, where they see each other in the hardware store, and at the school play, and at the funeral home, and at the high school football game. The person who stayed in their hometown has been building that network for 50 years. The person who moved, even if they moved for good reasons, even if they built wonderful things somewhere new, started over. Here's something that rarely gets said about starting over. Starting over is expensive. Not financially, socially, emotionally. Every time a person moves to a new city, they begin the accumulation process from scratch. New neighbors who are strangers. New colleagues who don't know their history. A new doctor who has never seen them before. New community that hasn't decided yet whether to trust them. All of it requires energy. All of it takes time. All of it is building something that the person who stayed already has. There's a man named Gary. He's 58. He left his hometown in Indiana at 22 for a job in Seattle. Spent 12 years there. Then a company move took him to Atlanta. Then a divorce took him to Denver. He's in Phoenix now, and has been for 8 years, which is the longest he's lived anywhere since he left Indiana. He describes something he's only started to name in the last few years. A specific kind of tiredness that comes from always being in the middle of building something that the people around him already have. Never quite knowing the full story of the place he's in, or being the person who remembers what used to be on that corner before the new building went up. Always being a relatively recent arrival in someone else's established world. He doesn't frame this as a mistake. He made choices that made sense at the time. But he says that when he visits Indiana, which he still does, once or twice a year, there's a quality to being there that he can't find anywhere else. Quality he can't reproduce no matter how long he stays in Phoenix. He knows what it is now, it's being known. Not famous, not admired, just known. The way people are known in places where they've been for a long time, where the context of their life is available to the people around them without explanation. It's what the person who never left their hometown has, that is genuinely difficult to replicate elsewhere. But here's the part of this conversation that needs to be honest. Everyone who stayed did so from wisdom or clarity or a sophisticated understanding of what roots provide. Some people stayed because leaving was frightening, because the unknown genuinely intimidated them, because the familiar was comfortable in a way that the unfamiliar was not, and they confused that comfort with contentment. That's a real thing, and it's worth naming without judgment. Psychological research distinguishes between what's called approach motivation and avoidance motivation. Approach is when you're moving towards something you genuinely want. Avoidance is when you're staying away from something you fear. Both can look identical from the outside. The person who stayed because they genuinely valued what staying would build. The relationships, the knowledge, the belonging, the deep familiarity, that person made an approach choice. And the research suggests they tend to report high life satisfaction, strong social networks, a stable sense of identity that persists through difficulty. The person who stayed because leaving felt too risky, that person made an avoidance choice. And they often carry a specific kind of quiet unease, a wondering, a low-level sense of what might have been, not because leaving was necessarily better, but because the choice was made from fear rather than from genuine desire. Only the person inside the life knows which one it is. Think about your own hometown for a moment, wherever that was, the specific smell of it in a particular season, the sound of a certain street at a certain hour, the face of someone who has known you longer than almost anyone else on earth. What does it feel like to think about it now? Not whether you should have stayed or should have left, just what does it feel like? There's something in that feeling that the psychology has a name for. Researchers who study place attachment, the emotional bond between people and specific locations, describe it as one of the most fundamental human orientations. It's not nostalgia, exactly. Nostalgia is about the past. Place attachment is about the present, about the way a specific location becomes part of how a person understands who they are. The man at the gas station on the corner of Elm and Fifth, the one with the coffee in the cup holder and the phone face down on the seat. He is not a person who failed to leave. He is a person who understood, not in these words, that what he was building by staying was not available anywhere else. Not because his town is special. Most towns aren't special in any dramatic sense, because he is of it, because it is of him, because the decades of shared mornings and familiar faces and accumulated history have done something that no apartment in a new city could replicate. They have made him part of a place in the way that only time makes possible. He picks up the phone, types back to his friend in Phoenix, maybe next year. You good? The friend responds immediately. All good. Miss you? He sets the phone down again. Looks out the windshield at the town. He misses his friend too. That's real. Distance is a cost. Not every person he grew up with is here anymore. Some moved away. Some died. Town has changed in ways that sometimes catch him off guard. A business he loved closed. A house torn down. A family that was a fixture suddenly gone. Staying doesn't protect you from loss. Nothing does. It gives you something that loss, when it comes, lands inside of. A context, a community, a network of shared memory that holds grief in a way that isolation cannot. The engine is running. It's going to be late if he doesn't pull out now. He takes one more sip of coffee, looks at the gas station sign, the same faded red trim that's been there since 1971, and something that isn't quite satisfaction and isn't quite gratitude, but is close to both of them moves through him. He pulls out into the street he's driven 1,000 times before, and goes toward the day. If this felt familiar to you, tell me if something in it described a life you've lived or a choice you made or a feeling you've carried without quite having the words for it, then you already understand what this was about. Not whether staying was right, but why staying, for some people, was never really a question at all. This kind of reflection, psychology that takes ordinary human lives seriously and tries to find what's actually real inside them, speaks to you, then this channel was made for exactly that. There's more of it here. Take your time with it. You've earned the right to move slowly. There's a detail about the Harvard study that doesn't get mentioned often enough. The researchers asked their participants, now in their 70s, 80s, even 90s, what they would have done differently. The most common answer wasn't about career, wasn't about money, and wasn't about travel or adventure or the places they didn't go. It was about relationships, about time with people, about being present in the lives of the people who mattered, finding lands differently depending on where a person has lived. For the man at the gas station, for Diane in Ohio, there are the thousands of Gen X adults who built their entire lives inside the borders of the place they were born. That finding tends to land as confirmation, not as revelation. They already know it. They've been living it. The relationships they built didn't happen in a year or two of geographic proximity. They happened across decades of being in the same town, the same neighborhood, sometimes the same street. The friendships that began in elementary school and survived every change that 50 years can bring. The neighbors who became family not by blood, but by shared time. Doctor who delivered their children and attended their parents' funerals. The network of people who know the full arc of their lives, not just the chapter that's currently open. That is not nothing. That is, according to the best and longest research we have on human well-being, close to everything. There's something else worth naming here. That's something specific to Generation X that makes the hometown question particularly interesting for people in their late 40s, 50s, and 60s right now. Gen X grew up in an era of extraordinary geographic and economic disruption. Their parents, in many cases, had moved from the places their own parents had lived, pulled by manufacturing jobs, military service, the great post-war expansion of American suburbs. The generation before them was already in the middle of a long disruption of place. Gen X experienced the continuation of that disruption. And then, many of them, a quiet decision that their children would not. There's a woman named Patricia. She's 56, grew up in the same Georgia town where her grandmother had lived, and where her own children now go to school, who describes the decision to stay in almost generational terms. She watched her parents move 3 times before she was 12. She watched the instability of that movement, the way each move meant a new school, new friends to make, new rhythms to learn, specific loneliness of being the new kid again and again. When it came time for her to decide where to land, she already knew. She wasn't choosing against adventure. She was choosing for continuity. For her kids to have what she had partially missed. The experience of growing up in a place where people knew their family, where their history was legible to the community around them. They could walk down the street as teenagers and be recognized not as strangers, but as someone's daughter, someone's granddaughter, someone who belonged. That choice required something. It required resisting a culture that consistently equated movement with ambition. That told her, implicitly, relentlessly, that the successful people left and the people who stayed were the ones who couldn't figure out how to go. She resisted that, quietly, without making much of it. And now, sitting in a town she has known her entire life, watching her grandchildren play in the same backyard where she played, she feels something that she describes simply as right. Not perfect. Life is never perfect. The town has its problems. She knows those problems in intimate detail because she has been here for all of them. The plant that closed and took 300 jobs. The family tragedies that rippled through a community small enough to feel everything. The ways that small town life can become suffocating if you let it. The way familiar faces can become pressure if the familiarity tips into obligation. She knows all of it, and she stayed anyway. Because the alternative, moving somewhere new, starting over, trading the weight of deep history for the lightness of anonymity never felt like a trade she wanted to make. The AARP has studied social connectedness among adults over 50 more extensively than perhaps any other organization in the country. Their research consistently identifies something they call chronic loneliness as one of the most serious health risks facing older Americans, comparable in its effects to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. According to some studies, the adults least likely to report chronic loneliness are not the ones who traveled the most or lived in the most exciting cities. They are the ones with the most stable, long-term social networks, the ones who have people in their lives who have known them for decades, the ones embedded in communities where their history is known and their presence is expected. Gen Xers, adults who never left their home, are disproportionately represented in that group. Not because staying is automatically protective, because the specific act of staying long enough to become genuinely embedded in a place tends to produce exactly the kind of social network that the research consistently identifies as the most protective of long-term health and well-being. This is not an argument against leaving. People leave for good reasons. They find things in new places that they couldn't have found at home. They grow in ways that distance makes possible. All of that is true. It is an argument for taking seriously what staying builds, what it accumulates, what it makes possible over the course of a full human life. People who chose to remain, who built their entire adult existence inside the geography of their beginning, were not playing it safe. They were making a sophisticated bet that depth matters more than breadth, that knowing a place completely is worth more than knowing many places partially. It's that being known by a community across the full arc of a life is worth more than the freedom of permanent reinvention. The decades have a way of clarifying whether bets like that were correct. For the man pulling out of the gas station on the corner of Elm and Fifth, coffee cooling, phone face down, the town opening up around him in every direction, the decades have been clear enough. He doesn't think about it in those terms. He just drives. Past the hardware store, past the church, past the street where he taught his daughter to ride a bike on a Sunday afternoon that feels like it happened last week and 30 years ago at the same time. He's part of this place in a way that can't be undone. The place is part of him in a way that doesn't need explaining. That's the whole of it, really. That's what staying built.